My name is Edna Calloway. I am 74 years old, and for 43 years I have kept a tape recording in a shoebox at the back of my bedroom, closet under 2 folded wool blankets, and a hat I have not worn since Roy's funeral. The tape is a standard 60-minute cassette on a Panasonic recorder, and it contains 47 minutes of a man's voice, describing something that the official RCMP incident log for November 14, 1980, describes only as disoriented male, possible exposure, hypothermia-induced confusion, no further action required. I was the dispatch operator who logged that call. I was one of 4 people in the Terrace detachment who heard what Walter Fenn actually said before Sergeant Pete Hargreaves wrote the summary, closed the file, and told us, in the particular quiet way Pete had of telling you something was finished, that we would not be discussing this further. Pete Hargreaves died in the spring of 2009. My husband Roy died in March of 2018. Constable Darlene Moyer, who is 81 now, and living in Prince Rupert with her daughter, telephoned me last October when she heard that Walter had died, and she said, "Edna, you should say what you know before you can't." Walter left me a letter from the hospice. He asked me to speak. I have been sitting at this kitchen table for 2 hours, with the recorder running and the window open and the dark line of the trees showing against the sky. And I have been trying to decide where to begin, because the beginning is not November 14th. The beginning is June 14, 1977, which is the last day anyone in the ordinary world saw Walter Fenn alive. Walter Fenn was 43 years old in the summer of 1977, which means he was born in 1934. And I mention this because the year matters, because a man born in 1934 in northern British Columbia grew up in a particular relationship to the land, which is to say, he grew up understanding that the land was not symbolic and not recreational, but simply the condition of his life, the way water is the condition of a fish's life, something you move through without thinking. He had worked as a surveyor for the Provincial Roads Ministry for 11 years at the point of his disappearance. He was not a man who got lost. His crew chief, a man named Francis Doucette from Smithers, told the search coordinator that Walter was the best orienteer he had ever worked with, that Walter could read a slope and a watershed and a drainage the way other men read a newspaper, instinctively, without effort, which is why what happened made so little sense to anyone who looked at the official record, which was that Walter Fenn walked out of a road survey camp on the Skeena watershed east of Terrace on the morning of June 14, 1977, to take a bearing on the ridgeline approximately 400 meters to the northeast. And he did not come back. Francis sent 2 men after him at noon. They found his transit case on a flat ledge of rock above a creek drainage. They found 1 boot print in a soft patch of soil at the creek bank, pointing north and slightly east into the timber. They found nothing else. The search ran for 11 days and covered, by the coordinator's count, approximately 240 square kilometers of that country, which is country that does not yield its information easily. It is steep, wet, heavily timbered country with creek drainages that fold into one another in ways that make a compass reading useful and a man's intuition essential, and they used both, and they still found nothing. 11 days in that kind of country is not a small search. At the end of it, the coordinator filed a finding of presumed death by misadventure, which is the phrase they use when a man goes into the northern forest and does not come back and the forest will not return him. Walter's wife, Doris Fenn, received the finding and waited 14 months, and then had Walter declared legally dead, and within the year had married a contractor from Kittymart named Bertrand Selkirk, which I do not say to judge her, because she had 2 children under 12 and a mortgage and a world that does not stop, moving simply because a man has walked into the trees. She did what she needed to do. I understood that completely when it happened, and I understand it now. I need to tell you something about how the night of November 14, 1980, began before I tell you what happened on it, because the how of it matters as much as the what. The call came in at 11:47 in the evening. I was on the night shift, which I had been working for 6 years at that point, because Roy worked days at the mill, and we had an arrangement about our daughter, who was 8, and the night shift suited me in other ways that have nothing to do with this story. The call came from a logging road flagman named Chester Wills, who had been driving the Callum Lake Road back toward town, and had seen a figure in his headlights at the edge of the road, standing still, facing his truck. Chester told me later that what struck him before anything else was that the man was standing completely still, and that he did not flinch at the headlights. He just stood there in them as if he had been placed there, as if stillness was his natural condition. And the headlights were simply another thing in the world to be still in front of. Chester stopped the truck. The man walked to Chester's window. He said, in a voice Chester described to me as very low and very careful, as if each word was being chosen from a great distance, the way a person speaks when they are relearning the shapes of a language. I need to go to town. That was all. Chester said his name is Walter and drove him to the detachment. When Chester came through the door with Walter behind him, I did not recognize him at first, and this is the thing I have thought about most often in the years since. Because Walter Fenn had been missing for 3 years and 5 months, and I had been one of the people who logged his disappearance, and I had seen his photograph in the file, and still, I did not recognize him for approximately 30 seconds, and I have always wondered what it was that made him look so different from his photograph. He was not thinner. He was, in fact, heavier than the photograph. The file had listed his weight at departure as 161 pounds, and when we weighed him that night, he came in at 194, which surprised the on-call physician, Dr. Alan Sato, who said afterward that he had expected starvation and found instead a man who appeared to have been eating well and doing hard physical labor for 3 years. His hair was very long and had been bound with something I could not identify, a strip of plant material or bark, twisted into a cord of surprising neatness. His clothing was his own, the same canvas work shirt and denim pants he had been wearing when he disappeared, worn through in places and repaired, crudely but effectively, with what appeared to be sinew or a similar material. His boots were gone. His feet were bare and were not, as you would expect, damaged by cold, though the temperature that night was -4 Celsius. They were calloused in a way that Dr. Sato said he had not seen before. The sole of each foot was, the doctor said, approximately as thick as 2 layers of boot leather pressed together. His hands were the hands of a man who had been working with them continuously for years. Not injured but profoundly changed, the skin of the palm so dense it had a particular look that I can only describe as earned, the way a tool takes on a look after long use that separates it from a tool that has only been cleaned. Darlene Moyer stood in the corner of the room during the examination and said nothing. She had a notebook and she wrote nothing in it. She told me later, the only time we spoke of it directly, that she had understood from the first 30 seconds that whatever Walter had to say was not going to fit in a notebook, that the categories the notebook provided were not the right ones, and that she had decided to simply be present and to remember, and that she had done that, and that she would go on doing it until she couldn't. Pete Hargreaves arrived at the detachment at midnight. He had been called at home, and he came in his civilian coat, which I had never seen before. It was a wool car coat, dark green, and something about the coat made the whole situation feel more serious, which I know is an odd thing to say, but it is true. Pete looked at Walter for a long time, and then he said, "Walter Fenn," not as a question, as a statement that needed to be said aloud to be confirmed. Walter said, "Yes." Pete said, "We thought you were dead." Walter said, "I know that." Then Pete did something I had not expected, which was that he sat down in the chair across from Walter and said nothing further and waited, which was not Pete's characteristic mode. Pete was a man of procedure and sequence, and his sitting down and waiting told me that he had understood already that this was not a procedural situation. It was a situation that required something else from him, and he was deciding what that something was. Pete Hargreaves called Roy and asked him to drive me home that night. I asked Roy to stop first. I made coffee and set the Panasonic on the table and asked Walter if he would speak into it, and he said yes, but quietly, "Please." I said quietly was fine. What I have to tell you next is what is on the tape. I have listened to it more times than I can count, and I have decided not to play it for you in this recording, because Walter's voice belongs to Walter and to the family he described, and not to any larger audience, but I can tell you what he said, which is my right and my obligation, because he left me the letter, and the letter said, "Tell them what you know." He said this because he knew what I know, which is that I am 74 years old, and the people who heard it with me are dead or old, and the tape will outlast all of us, but only if someone speaks for it while she still can. Walter said he did not get lost. He said he was following the creek drainage northeast of camp because he had seen, from the ridgeline, a shadow in the timber above the creek that he could not account for by any rock formation or tree arrangement he had catalogued in 11 years of working that watershed, and the surveyor's instinct in him could not leave an unaccounted feature alone. He climbed toward it. He said the shadow, when he reached it, was not a shadow, but a stillness. He said he did not have a better word than stillness. He said it was the kind of stillness that has a center, the kind you feel in the chest before you understand it with the mind. And he stood at the edge of it, for what he estimated was between 5 and 8 minutes, not moving, because something in the quality of that stillness told him that the correct response to it was to match it. He told me there were 6 of them, and then he corrected himself and said 7. And then he stopped and said he was not sure. Counting was the right way to think about it. He said the first one he saw clearly was the largest. He said he was standing among the spruce, upright, and that his first instinct was to estimate the height, because that was how he had been trained to see. And his estimate was 8.5 feet, perhaps 9. He said the creature was looking at him with what he could only describe as professional attention, the way a man looks at a problem he has seen before and knows how to handle. He said he felt no fear in that moment. He said this carefully, twice, because he knew it sounded like the kind of thing a person says to make a story better. But he wanted it on record that it was not fear. It was closer to the feeling of being accurately seen, which is a different thing entirely, and, in his experience, rarer. He stayed. He did not decide to stay in the way you decide to take a road or accept a job. He told me it was more like a decision that was made in the body before the mind caught up. He said he sat down on a flat rock beside the creek and stayed sitting for the better part of a day, and that the large one, the elder male as he came to think of him, moved through the timber at various distances and angles across those hours, in a way that Walter described as orientation. Not display, not threat. Something more like the movements of a man who is establishing the perimeter of a space so that another man can understand where the edges are. By the time the light failed, Walter understood, in some practical orienteer's way, that the edges were generous. He slept where he sat. He woke to find food at his left hand, a stack of roots and what appeared to be dried fish, placed there without sound. He told me the fear came later and intermittently in the first 3 weeks, and that each time it came it resolved, and it resolved not because anything happened, but because nothing did. He said the absence of threat, sustained over time, eventually produces something he had no word for, some state between trust and knowledge, and that he believed this was what they were waiting for, not for his fear to stop, but for that other state to begin. He said the female was the first to approach him closely, within arm's reach, and that she did this on the 11th day, in the afternoon, setting a large piece of bark at his feet, with something laid on it that turned out, upon examination, to be freshwater mussels opened with a flat stone. He said she did this, and then sat back on her heels, very still, and waited, and he ate. And she watched him eat with the same professional attention the elder had given him on the first day, and when he finished she made a sound very low, almost below hearing, and went back into the trees. He said that was the 11th day. After that he stopped counting. He described the daily life of those 3 years, in a particular way, which is to say, not as adventure and not as hardship, but as work. The clan had work, specific and recurring, and his presence over time shifted from witness to participant. He described the way the younger males organized the movement of the group from camp to foraging, ground and back, and how this movement was not random, but followed a logic he came to understand as both seasonal and precautionary. Each route slightly varied from the last, to leave no worn path, no sign that would concentrate in a single trackable line. He said he began to contribute to this navigation in the 2nd year, not leading, but offering his surveyors knowledge of water and slope, when it seemed to be useful, and that the younger males incorporated his suggestions, without ceremony, without any indication that accepting them from a human was strange, which he said was one of the things he found most difficult to translate into English when he tried to describe it, because in English there would need to be a moment of decision, a moment of crossing a line, and there was no such moment. There was only the gradual realization that he had been walking the routes with them for some time, and that his walking was part of the route now. He described the juveniles with care and economy. He said they were curious about him in the way that young things are curious about anything new, which is to say persistently, at close range, and with a complete indifference to whether the attention was welcome. They had a habit of examining his hands, his tools, the repairs in his clothing, turning things over with a concentrated attention that he recognized as the same attention the elder brought to the redirected drainage channel. And he found this recognition moving in a way he could not entirely account for. He said he watched one of the juveniles, the smaller of the two, spend the better part of an afternoon with one of the branch splints he had made for his own broken arm, turning it over and running a finger along the lashing in a way that was precise and unhurried and somehow deeply serious, and that he sat quietly and watched this and felt something that he said was as close to contentment as anything he had felt in his life up to that point, which is a remarkable thing for a man to say about watching a young animal examine a piece of wood. And I believed him entirely, because I know what it looks like when a man is telling you the exact truth about something he has spent years thinking about and has only just now found the right words for. I need to tell you what Walter told me about the elder, because the elder is the center of everything he said, and if I leave him to the end, I will not have enough room to do him properly. Walter said the elder was old. He said he had the quality of old things, not fragility but density, a kind of compression that comes from having endured long enough for the world to press itself into you, and that you could see it in the way he moved, which was never wasted, never tentative, always exactly sufficient to the task at hand. Walter said he weighed, by his best estimate, something between 450 and 500 pounds, and that he carried this weight the way a large tree carries its crown, without any visible effort, as if the weight were simply the correct amount to be. Walter said his face was the thing he was least able to describe, and he tried 3 times on the tape, and I will tell you what he settled on. Which was this, he said. The face was ancient without being old, he said. There was something in the brow and the eyes that registered a longer experience of the world than any human face he had seen. Not wisdom as we usually mean it, not accumulated learning, but something more like the look of a being who has watched many things come and go and has arrived at a position of complete acceptance of what the world is. And that this acceptance was not resignation, but something more like authority. He said the eyes were dark brown and very clear, and that the first time the elder looked at him directly, which was on the 3rd day, Walter understood that he was being known specifically as an individual, not as a type or a species or an intrusion, but as himself, which was Walter Fenn from Terrace, 43 years old, a man who could read a watershed and who had, for reasons neither of them could probably explain, sat down on a flat rock beside a creek and stayed. I do not know why they let him stay. I have thought about this for 43 years, and I do not have an answer. Walter said he did not know either. He said he asked himself the question every week for the first year, and then stopped asking it, because the asking felt like an insult to something he could not name, as if demanding a reason for a kindness were the same thing as refusing it. I did not know what to do with that when he said it in my kitchen in 1980, and I know what to do with it now, which is to set it down without explanation and let it sit. He lived in the clan for 3 years and 5 months. He helped them in ways that made use of what he was. He told me about one late spring, 2 years into his time with them, when the creek drainage that supplied the clan's primary foraging ground was showing signs, to Walter's trained eye, of the kind of subsurface instability that precedes a washout, and he spent 4 days using rocks and packed earth to redirect a secondary drainage channel in a way that distributed the spring runoff more evenly across the slope. he said. The elder watched this work for most of the 4 days, from a distance of approximately 20 meters, without interrupting it. When the work was done, and the drainage held through the next rain, the elder walked to the redirected channel and bent down and ran his open hand along the line of the new earthwork, the way a person runs a hand along, something they want to remember by touch. Walter said this was one of the clearest communications he received in the entire 3 years. That gesture, that careful tracing of the work with the hand, and that he understood it to mean something like, "I see what you did, and I see why," which is different from thank you but contains it. Walter broke his left forearm in the second winter. He fell on ice above the camp. He did not lose consciousness, and he set the arm himself, roughly, using 2 straight branches and strips of his canvas shirt. And he told me it was not a good set, and he knew it, and that the pain was significant for the first 6 weeks. He said, what happened during those 6 weeks was something he had difficulty speaking about, without feeling he would be disbelieved. The elder male brought him food every day, directly, which he had not done before. Walter had always foraged with the others, or been brought food by the female or the younger males. The elder bringing food was different in a way Walter said he felt, but could not measure. He said one of the younger males sat with him at night for the first 3 weeks, very close, not touching, close enough that the warmth of the animal was perceptible, and that on 2 occasions, when the pain was severe in the night, he heard the younger male begin a sound, very low and sustained, that Walter described as something between a resonance and a tone, felt in the chest more than heard with the ears, and that the sound coincided with a reduction in the pain that Walter said he would not try to explain because he had no frame for explaining it. And he was not, he said, the kind of man who explained things he could not account for. The arm healed. The set was not perfect, and he had a slight angle in the forearm for the rest of his life, which I noticed when he sat across from me at my kitchen table, which is how I know this part of what he told me was true. He tried to leave twice before the third and final time. The first was in the second spring, when something in the lengthening days produced a homesickness so acute that he told me it felt physical, like a hand around the throat, and he walked south one morning with the intention of following the drainage to the Skeena, and then following the Skeena to the road. He had gone perhaps 3 kilometers when he heard the tone sound behind him, at a distance, sustained, and he stopped and stood still and felt the homesickness change shape in his chest, not go away, but change into something more complicated, something that had 2 directions at once, and he turned back. He said he was not compelled. He said this very clearly, twice. No one stopped him, and no one followed him, and the sound stopped. The moment he turned back, as if it were simply an acknowledgement of his choice, rather than a cause of it. The second attempt was in the 3rd autumn, and followed a similar pattern, and he turned back more quickly. And he told me he understood by then that the turnings back were not failures but information, that his body was telling him something his mind could not yet accept, which was that he was not finished, that there was something still incomplete in what he was doing there, and that the incomplete thing was not a task, but a quality of attention, a way of receiving something that requires time to receive properly. The 3rd departure was the one that held. He said he knew it was the final one when he woke on the morning of October 22nd, 1980, which is the date gave me, because Walter gave dates for everything, and they were always exact, and he knew it not because anything had changed, but because something had completed, and that the completion was not happiness or satisfaction, but a kind of rightness, the feeling of having reached the end of a sentence that was supposed to end there. He spent the morning in the camp, going about the ordinary routines of those 3 years, the water carrying and the wood moving, and the quiet attention to the day, and he said he found that each ordinary thing had a particular clarity to it, not a heightened significance, but a cleanness, as if everything were showing its actual face, which is what things do when you are seeing them for the last time, and you know it. In the afternoon he went to the elder male and stood before him, and looked at him for a long time. The elder looked back. Then the elder held up his open hand, palm outward, fingers spread, at the level of his chest, and held it perfectly still. And Walter held up his own hand in the same way, the mirror of it. And they stood like that for, Walter said, longer than it takes a man to cross a field at a walking pace. Then the elder turned and walked back into the trees and did not look back, and Walter watched until the timber had closed completely behind him. And then Walter walked south. I have thought about that gesture for 43 years. When Walter described it in my kitchen at 11:50 at night in November 1980, I understood it the way you understand a word in a language you are only beginning to learn. The rough shape of the meaning, the approximate weight of it, but not the precise content. Walter said, when I asked him what he thought it meant, that he believed it meant, you are known here, that you, Walter specifically, had been seen and recognized and accepted as a real thing in this place, and that the gesture was the elder's way of saying that this knowing did not expire with the departure, that it was a permanent state, that wherever Walter went the fact of having been known here would remain true. Walter said he had not spoken English for 3 years, and that formulating this interpretation in English felt inadequate to it, like trying to pour a river into a cup, and that the cup was not a failure, it was simply not the river. He said he understood, as he walked south, that the family would move, that the departure of the one human member of the clan was also, probably, a signal that the place had changed, that the season of it was over, and that they would go deeper into the watershed or further north along the range, and that he would not find them again if he looked, and that he did not intend to look, because looking would be a misunderstanding of what had happened between them, which was not a thing that could be maintained by proximity, but a thing that existed in its own right, complete, the way a finished sentence exists in its own right. After the words have been spoken, he walked for 23 days to reach the Callum Lake Road. He was not hurrying, and he was not lost. He arrived on the evening of November 13th, and slept in the timber near the road, and walked out the following night, and Chester Wills found him in his headlights at 11:43 in the evening. Roy drove home with me and Walter at 2 in the morning. I have thought many times about Roy that night, about what he made of it, because Roy was a man of pronounced practicality, who had exactly 2 responses to things that exceeded his categories, which were silence and the offering of tea. And that night he offered both. He sat at the table while Walter spoke, and he made 3 pots of tea, and he said nothing for 47 minutes, and when the tape ran out, he looked at me, and then he looked at Walter, and he said, in the voice he used for things that were settled, "You'll need clothes." And Roy went to the back bedroom and came back with a pair of his own work pants and a flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks, which he set on the counter without making an occasion of it. And Walter took them and said, "Thank you." And Roy said, "It's cold out." And that was the whole of it. In the morning, Roy drove Walter to the detachment, and Hargreaves wrote the file the way Hargreaves wrote it and closed it the way he closed it. And that was the official end of the story of Walter Fenn. Walter went north the following spring. He worked a fishery out of Prince Rupert for 3 seasons and then moved further north to the Stikine watershed and worked as a surveyor again, independently, on contract to various resource companies. And he lived alone for the remainder of his working life, which ended in his early 70s when his eyesight began to go. He never married again. He called me twice a year, in April and in October, without fail for 42 years, and we talked about the country and about Roy, and about his arm, which ached in the cold, and about what it meant to keep a thing, and whether keeping it was the same as protecting it, or whether keeping it was simply the form that his life had taken, the shape it had grown, into the way a tree grows around a fence post, not because it chose the fence post, but because the fence post was there and the tree grew anyway. He said once, on an October call, that he thought about the elder every single day. Not obsessively, he said, not with longing, but the way you think about a country you have lived in, with a settled awareness of its existence, with the knowledge that it is there even when you are not, and that this knowledge is a form of company. He said, "The world is more full than people think, Edna." He said it simply, without drama, the way a man states a fact he has verified personally and does not need to argue. I want to tell you what it was like to keep the tape for 43 years, because I do not think keeping is a passive thing, and I want to be honest about what it cost. In the first years, it was a kind of alertness, a habitual attention to what I said and to whom, a small discipline that became ordinary quickly enough, the way any discipline becomes ordinary if you practice it long enough. Roy knew, and Darlene Moore knew, and Pete Hargreaves knew, and Dr. Alan Sato knew in the way that a man can know something while officially maintaining that he does not. And that was the perimeter of it. 4 people and a shoebox and a promise. When Pete died in 2009, the perimeter contracted by 1. And when Roy died in 2018, it contracted further. And the smaller it got, the heavier the tape seemed to become. Not because the tape had changed, but because each person who had known about it was a point of support, and the removal of that point redistributed the weight to those of us who remained. By the time Walter's letter arrived in January of last year, I was the last one who had been in the room, and the tape weighed more than I have words to say. That is not self-pity. It is a description of a physical sensation I experienced each morning when I opened my bedroom closet and saw the shoebox on the shelf and understood that everything inside it was mine alone to carry until I chose to set it down. He died on the 8th of December last year in a hospice in Smithers. He was 87 years old. His arm had the slight angle in it from the break that had healed imperfectly in the second winter of those 3 years. The hospice nurse who telephoned me said he was peaceful, which is the word they use, and I believe in his case it was accurate. I believe he had been peaceful for a long time, in the particular way that a person is peaceful when they have received something complete and have found a way to carry it that does not fight the carrying. Roy is gone now, and Pete Hargreaves is gone, and Darlene Moyer is 81, and I am 74, and the tape in the shoebox has been rewound and played so many times that the leader strip is worn almost through. which means it will not last very many more playings. And I think that is part of why I am making this recording, because the tape will outlast the tape, if that makes sense to you. If the words of what is on it exist somewhere outside the magnetic coating, on a strip of polyester in a shoebox under 2 wool blankets. I know there are people who will not believe what I have told you, and I know that this is not my problem. I kept it for 43 years, not because I was afraid of disbelief, but because I had made a promise, and promises of that kind do not expire simply because the person you made them to is gone. They expire when you decide they are finished. And I have decided, with Roy gone, and Pete gone, and Walter gone, and the tape's leader strip worn thin, that this one is finished. Roy saw something the night Walter came home that he never described to me. I know he saw it, because when I came back into the kitchen, after helping Walter into the shower, he was standing at the kitchen window in the dark, which was not a thing Roy did, and he was holding something in both hands, carefully, the way you hold something you are not sure you have permission to touch. And when I came in, he set it down on the windowsill and turned around and said nothing. In the morning it was gone. He never told me what it was, and I never asked, because I understood that Roy had been given something that belonged to him alone, some piece of the story that had his name on it, and not mine, and that asking would be a misunderstanding of the gift. I have thought about it often. I will not know what it was. That is one of the things I mean when I say the world is more full than we knew. The fullness includes the parts you cannot see, the things at the edge of another person's privacy, the gifts that were meant for someone else and that you can only understand were given, not what they were. I am going to press stop now. The window is still open and the trees are still dark against the sky and the recorder is running. And I have said what I came here to say. Walter asked me to speak before I couldn't, and I have spoken, and I think he would find it accurate, and I think Roy would find it accurate, and I think Pete Hargreaves, who was not a man who ever said more than he needed to, would look at me from across his desk with that particular quiet expression of his, and nod once, which was his way of saying that a thing had been done correctly. The tape is in the shoebox. The shoebox is under 2 blankets and a hat in the back of my closet. I have written the date on the label in my own handwriting. That is enough. It is more than enough. The elder held up his open hand, palm outward, fingers spread, and Walter held up his own hand in return. And that gesture is complete. And everything that needed to be said between them was said in it, and I have been the keeper of that completeness for 43 years, and now I am setting it down.